right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Tuesday evening lecture series. This presentation is being recorded. If you have any questions, please type in your question in the chat function, and I will do my best to relay the questions to our speaker at an appropriate time. Alternatively, you can also use the raise your hand function, so I know you have a question to ask, or you can wait till the end when we have a short question answer session. Tonight's lecture is Migration Biology and what that teaches us about our conservation efforts, and is being presented by Dr. Emily Cohen, Assistant Professor at the Appalachian Laboratory, University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. Research in Dr. Cohen's lab broadly aims to understand animal migration biology in the context of the full annual cycle. Dr. Cohen's research makes use of field, lab, and remotely sensed data integrated with rigorous quantitative tools to address fundamental questions about migration biology, understand how and why migration is changing and migratory species are declining, and develop tools for the inclusion of stopover and airspace habitats into conservation and management efforts for migratory species. And with that, Dr. Cohen, you have the stage.
All right, let me share the screen. Hi, Baltimore Bird Club. Thank you for having me. I am out in Western Maryland here at these are all of the different labs that make up the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. Maybe you've heard of some of them, like the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory is the largest one, and Horn Point. And so UMCES is a fairly unique university. We're one of the universities in the Maryland system, but we don't have undergraduate education. It's just research, and with a particular emphasis on applied research for managing global resources as well as Maryland's natural resources. And so I'm out here in Frostburg, sitting in my home office this evening, and we're the smallest lab, and we're like the terrestrial lab. So obviously a lot of these labs are focused on Chesapeake resources, whereas I'm pretty terrestrial, as you'll see. And so just as I get started, I'm going to tell you kind of an overview of a bunch of migration research. And I am very happy for you to use the raise hand function and let me know if any of it is not making sense to you, because for one, it is hard on a Tuesday night to drive from here all the way down to here. So that was nice to go on Zoom. On the other hand, giving a lecture on Zoom is sort of like sitting in my room at night talking to myself about things I already know about. And so it's just not that engaging. And so if you feel like leaving your camera on, I'm looking at your faces, and that makes it a little more fun. And if you feel like using the raise hand function to tell me if the thing that I know a lot about isn't making a lick of sense to you, well, then I would like to know that before I keep going. Yeah, and so this is my contact information if you have any follow-up questions or interests. And these are my lab members. I have a new lab at the Appalachian lab. We call ourselves the Animal Migration Research Group, and I have two PhD students working with me, Claire and Luke, and one master's student, Megan, and a postdoctoral fellow, Jolie. And we're all working on projects related to migratory birds. Let's see, anything else about that? Okay. My research program is on migration biology in the context of the full annual cycle. And so I do mostly focus on songbirds, migrants, but I'm really And I can be called an ornithologist, but I'm just really excited about the phenomenon of migration broadly. I think it's the most exciting behavior, and I'm happy to work with bats and insects and lots of the other animals that also migrate. So I was telling Neville, I'm more of an ecologist than a birder. Some of the students in my lab are really awesome birders, and I love that. And I do like to go out birding, but I'm not a big lister. I like to just I like to identify species and sort of more watch behaviors in natural environments and try to understand those relationships than like chasing vagrants and keeping big lists. This is just my personal, not judging anyone else's interests. I hang out with a lot of birders, but that is sort of my my background and entrance into this field. A lot of animals migrate. You probably know about monarch butterflies, but there's also dragonflies, and you probably know about salmon, but there's so many other fishes that are migratory, sea turtles, and lots of marine mammals, most of the taxonomic groups of birds have migratory species within them, and bats. It's really the most fascinating and dramatic animal behavior, if I do say so myself. And so just recently, we're kind of finishing up with fall migration. But all sorts of animals have been undergoing dramatic physiological changes, putting on half of their body weight as fat, and preparing for these long distance migrations that are happening all over the world. That's an older map from MoveBank. There's a whole lot more data now, but one of the things that's really amazing is there's still so much that we don't understand about these behaviors. We don't understand how populations are connected between phases of the annual cycle. We don't know much about the mechanisms of how they achieve these dramatic lifestyles, and we still don't know how, where, or what is ultimately driving the declines of many of these species. But what we do know is that migratory species are declining, and they're declining faster than non-migratory species. And so I'm sure, given the level of outreach that was put into this 3 billion birds lost paper, that you've all heard about this. But we've lost we've lost about 30% of our migratory individuals across species. So it's a dramatic decline that's happening. And so this work is urgent, understanding the drivers of these declines. And it's in some ways not surprising that we don't fully understand the life cycle of a little animal like a Baltimore oriole that flies back and forth across continents and is really too small to carry a tracker. And so, but the good news with regards to animal migration is that, oh, I got off track on my slide, but the good news with regards to animal migration is that it's also a really exciting time. So we have all of these new emerging tools to understand how animals are accomplishing these dramatic feats, and also to understand where and when their populations are limited. And so this is a figure showing eBird, which I'm guessing this crowd knows a lot about, citizen science data sets. We can also use intrinsic markers like tissue, isotopic tissues in feathers to assign birds to where they molted those feathers so we can make those connections. Another intrinsic marker is their genetics of population differentiation using SNPs. And as maybe you've heard of the Genoscape project, we also have tracking devices that are getting smaller and smaller. They're still pretty limited for songbird species, but the level of information is pretty amazing. And then a couple other data sets that we have available are long-term. We have 100 years of banding and returns, re-encounter records within our USGS housed banding data sets. So that's what this is a map of. And one other remote sensing tool that I'm going to talk about almost all of these tools in my talk, I guess not tracking, but you can see my mouse, right? Okay. Another remotely sensed data set that we have is our network of national weather radars. And so when you on your app get the weather prediction from meteorologists, what they do is filter out the bird data, the biological information within those data sets, and focus on the weather signals. But what we do as radar aeroecologists is use the biological information and throw out the weather information as clutter. And so if you follow the birdcast, for example, which a lot of birders do, that's based on weather radar data sets. So this is the slide that I got out of order on, but even, despite the fact that the migratory animals are having these dramatic declines, migration is still the least studied phase of the annual cycle. So a few years ago, we did this literature review where we looked at multiple taxonomic groups and found that there's a huge bias towards breeding season studies. And part of this is logistical. It's easier to study a species when it's more sedentary and it has sort of a point-based central location around a nest or a breeding site or whatever. And also for a lot of the temperate tropical species, there's just a lot more research in temperate zones than there is in tropical zones. And so there is a logistical reasons for this bias, but nevertheless, it's really held us back from understanding the drivers of declines of migratory species and just really to having a full picture of their annual cycle. This second figure here is showing how few studies incorporate seasonal interactions. So how something that happens in one season influences the next season, influences the next season, and that they're not independent really. So that is the other part of migration in the context of the full annual cycle. So all of these tools are making it possible to change that. And we are seeing that. There's a lot more research on migration. I don't know. It's hard for me to know what filters out from the science world to the birder world. So, but I feel like you're probably getting a sense that there's a lot of exciting stuff going on right now with tracking and eBird maps and the birdcast and the Genoscape project. And I collaborate with a few of those groups as well. But it's a pretty exciting time in this field. So like I said, I have some assumptions about kind of where you all are at with being birders, but I'm just going to walk you through the life cycle of the annual cycle of a migratory bird, which you probably already know, and then we'll focus in on those migratory periods. But so this little female American redstart is feeding a young in a nest. Could be in Maryland, near you, or up here near me. And they might take them about 2 to 3 months to build that nest and to raise young and hopefully fledge them, and then feed them during the post-fledging period, and then put on a whole lot of fat and gear up with those physiological changes and get ready for fall migration, where they make the trip maybe down from, I don't know, New Hampshire down to down the East Coast towards the Caribbean, and fall migration might take about a month. Molt may happen previous to leaving, or to some extent en route along fall migration, and then arrives in the wintering season. So maybe down in Jamaica, where this species has been studied quite a bit. And they might stay there half of the year, where the quality of the breeding habitat, of the non-breeding habitat they encounter, will influence how they do down in those areas, and to some extent influence their departure timing for spring migration, which is typically shorter than fall migration. And food availability at stopover sites, which is influenced by the spring phenology, which we know is advancing. It's getting earlier. At the dogwood tree in the front yard of the house where I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, blooms a whole lot earlier than it did, let's just say 30 years ago when I was a kid. So spring's getting earlier, and these birds have to match up those spring migration timing to that shifting phenology, and then to arrive back to that same breeding area, usually pretty close to where they nested the previous year. They have pretty high site fidelity. And so for the rest of my talk, I'm going to focus in on spring and fall migratory periods. And so the talk is not just about migratory birds, but about en route biology, or what happens during migration. And what happens during migration is pretty amazing. I mean, these birds are overcoming some pretty phenomenal challenges, and they're really good at it. And so, like, this little common yellowthroat is a fairly short distance migrant, but we caught this bird in spring after it had crossed the Gulf of Mexico, maybe coming up from Veracruz or all the way down the Yucatan Peninsula or over to Belize, flying across the Gulf of Mexico. And along the way, they have to find and maintain the right direction, cope with adverse weather over bodies of water, or that might slow them down across the land. They need to find suitable habitat for refueling. And in the spring, phenology shifting. And so the food's also potentially shifting. They need to acquire food pretty quickly, depending on where they're stopping relative to their breeding destination. They may stop for just one day and rest, or they may stop for a week or two and really fuel up and get in really good condition for that last leg of the trip, to make it to arrive on time to their breeding site in good condition. And when the weather's appropriate to initiate breeding. They also have to contend with competitors. And so stopover sites can have huge fallouts of birds. And there is a little bit of information, some of which I'll talk about, that there are density dependent effects, where the more individuals that are foraging at a site can reduce the fuel and make it harder to keep going on time. They need to avoid predators. So most of these little songbirds, which is mostly what I'm going to talk about, are the landbird, the songbird migrants. They don't tend to stop in the same places like a shorebird. Like shorebirds have, Delmarva Peninsula, so every year, but land birds tend to sort of blow with the wind and stop in different landscapes. And so they're not going to land in a place where they know much about the distribution of resources or the distribution of predators. So they have to stay safe while feeding quickly and getting some sleep. We don't know anything about really how they get sleep. Okay, we know just a little bit. They do like these semi-hemispheric sleep and micro naps, but it's been very poorly studied because they fly at night, forage in the day. That's not a winning combo from my perspective. So, it's really amazing, these little birds, how they overcome all of these challenges, and they're very good at it. It sounds very hard to us, but they're evolved with a suite of adaptations to overcome what these seem like very hard challenges. And so the issue with the declines has more to do with us, making it migration potentially more costly by putting up more anthropogenic barriers, which I'll get into a bit more. So I already sort of alluded to these stopover sites. So a little bird like a Baltimore oriole or a common yellow-throat, they could, in theory, if you look at the aerodynamics of like a flight model with the amount of a good amount of fat and the wing loading of the body size, they could in theory fly all the way from their wintering grounds to their breeding grounds. But that mostly isn't what we see. Most of these little birds are stopping multiple times en route. And so, for example, here on the northern US coast of the Gulf of Mexico, a bird might be flying around in Panama with, let's see, flying over, with tropical birds and toucans and ocelots, and then gear up, put on all that fat, fly out to maybe somewhere around the west coast of the Yucatan or the east coast of the Yucatan or Belize, and rest and refuel again, and then make the long hop over the Gulf of Mexico, which can take 18 to 24-hour nonstop flights. So if they leave at dusk, they're arriving between 10 and 2 the next day, and they can be quite lean from that flight. And then they might stop over again in the south somewhere, either on the Gulf Coast or further inland, and then make maybe another stop or two before then arriving to breeding. And so it is a race to arrive on time, but it's also like to minimize the time of the trip, but the goal is also to arrive to breeding in good energetic conditions so that they can acquire excellent mates and find a good nest site. So it's a balance of condition and timing. But so birds make frequent stops during migration, and what happens on the ground is just as important as what happens in the air. Like, we think of these migrations as like these, watching birds fly across the front of the moon, like the dramatic nocturnal flights. But most of what happens during migration is happening on the ground at stopover sites, and how long it takes them to refuel at these sites, and how well they do at finding the right food and dealing with competition and all those challenges determines the duration of the migratory period. So I do a lot of work with land birds, songbirds, and with stopover habitats. I'm going to get a drink of tea really quick if anyone has a question. Okay, so hopefully I sold you on the importance of stopover habitats for migrating birds. And one thing that we know is that these habitats are really critical to the survival of these populations but there's been really very little conservation effort put into stopover habitat, and that's basically for the same reason you see those biases and when research is conducted. It's hard to identify where the important habitats are, what would make a difference for certain declining species or populations. And so I think there's, as we're focusing more on migration biology, now that there's an increasing number of tools to do so, I think there's more of a focus on really trying to pay more attention on identifying and preserving and managing stopover habitats, but we're not quite there yet. It's not happening that much. And so what I'm going to do in the rest of this talk is go through what I see as the 4 key pieces of information that we would need to identify where we can make a difference for migratory birds at stopover habitat. And those, and I'm going to try to convince you that we now have the sufficient, the ability to acquire the information needed to identify key critical stopover habitats. And that information comes in the form of the distributions of birds en route. Where are they stopping over? Where are there hot spots? Where are they different between spring and fall? And then within those key areas, what is the quality of the habitat? What defines a high quality habitat during stopover? How are they doing in those areas? And then what are the threats to those habitats or to birds using those areas? And is there a way to reduce those threats to birds in those areas? And then ultimately, populations let's see, we need to also understand what populations are using those key habitats, so that we can identify like species of conservation of concern and even the particular populations of those species that are undergoing declines. If we can connect them to key stopover habitats, then those are going to be really important areas to conserve. And so we call that migratory connectivity. And so what I'm going to do is talk about kind of, a bunch of different research that I've done in my lab and with my students related to these 4 things. And I probably put together, Neville told me a whole hour of talking. And so, and also this is the part where I say to you, if what I'm saying, if you don't understand these data sets, because I'm going to jump around a bit, raise your hand and ask me the question so I can make sure you're staying with me. So the first studies are on distribution, like where are birds stopping over, like across vast regions. And the data set that we have for this is our national weather surveillance radar data. So we have, I don't know if it's exactly 143, but like 140 to 150 functional weather radars across the US. And we are so lucky in this country that these data are collected 24/7 year round. And not only that, but they are archived and available for use for anyone. I mean, it's not easy data to deal with, but like it's the hugest data set of animal movement that is collected anywhere. In Europe, they have NREM, so they have a group that's trying to consolidate methods across countries and other parts of the world. They're definitely radars, but it's not archived and available in the way that NOAA has that. And so the key thing here is that a weather radar you see this big front moving from west to east or sort of from southwest towards the northeast. And then And you can see the shape of this. You're used to seeing these on the radar on your app. Probably I am anyway. And so this is like a big rain front. But you can also see here, see these little circles. This is most likely birds lifting up at dusk, departing for migration. And so it's possible to see animal migration in the weather radar, and it requires it's a big data process which requires filtering out weather or days that have too much weather clutter that you can't use them, but it has just a huge coverage. And I don't know if you all look at the birdcast, but that is this is where they get that. This is where the birdcast comes from, the weather radar data set. And so unlike the birdcast, I'm just going to assume that you've heard of it, but the birdcast predicts the movement of birds, and it's getting better and better every year, especially during spring and fall migration. I see I have a question.
Somebody just shared the link for birdcast in the chat.
Oh, there we go. Perfect. Okay. And so the birdcast measures movement overhead. And so but that's not the way I use the radar. And I work with Jeff Bueller and other folks who I usually do my little dance here. You're not gonna be able to see me, but what I'm showing in this picture is the blue is the ground, and here's our radar. And so the radar is spinning around and getting up higher and higher and smaller circles, and then going back. So every 10 seconds, there's a sweep around, and some of them are lower to the horizon, and then some of them are higher up. And so if you're measuring birds moving, trying to figure out what my camera is, if you're measuring birds moving through the airspace, you use that pointing up angle, which is about 35 kilometer radius around the radar. But what the studies I'm going to show you here, we've used these same radar data, but to map birds, like the lower angle, it's hard to get in the picture, but the lower angles of the radar sweep the closest to the ground, and then to map it to the peak exodus of birds as they lift off in mass from stopover habitats. And from that, we can map it back down to the landscape. And so the reason this works is because birds tend to depart stopover at similar times, just after dusk. There's like this huge liftoff. And so I'm going to show you another little animation that shows how that works, where we identify that peak liftoff time, where there's little separation between the terrestrial habitats and the birds leaving, and then mapping them back down to where they were stopping. Oops.
Emily, quick question. Is this in any way linked with MODIS data, or this is completely separate?
Totally different, but I will talk about MODIS later.
All right, thanks.
So I got a little of everything in here. I don't have any genetics in here, although I do collaborate with them. But yeah, no, I'll talk about MODIS in a little bit. That's individual tracking. So the thing to keep in mind, it's a good question. The thing to keep in mind with radar is we don't know what's going on with individuals. In fact, we can't even identify species. It's just reflectivity biomass. And so the radar is shooting out a radar beam and shooting it back. And the pattern that we get in terms of the reflectivity and the radial velocity tells us something about the biological biomass in the airspace. And then we can use what we know about behavior to filter out, say, insects, but we really can't separate birds and bats, or big birds and little birds. But we know from behavior that nocturnal migrants are what we're sampling when we get that exodus. I'm going to show you a little video of what that looks like. Not of the actual what it looks like, because that would be way cooler, but what it looks like radar. Okay, so there's a lot here. If you follow this bar at the bottom, this is time. This is showing the radar sampling through time. Remember, I showed this sweeping. And so, and this is what it looks like. You can see how the red is the high biomass. And so you can see how when it's down here, it's little, they're all going, and then they're all spread out and you get no more signal. So this is Lake Charles, right? No, this is Louisiana. So this figure is identifying, here's the peak onset. And so, yeah, there's more biomass later, but it's separated from the landscape. And so what we want is that period of time when the radar echo maps down to the landscape. And you can see birds are taking off from the coastline here. So that's the way we're using these data to map stopover habitat across large extents. And so I'm going to show you some results from a recently published study for the Gulf of Mexico, where we use, 8 years of data and spring and fall migration every 2 weeks during spring and fall for, I forget how many radars. These two in Mexico weren't part of this study, but we use them for other studies. So it was just the US coast here across the US coastline of Gulf of Mexico. And then we had to do these Florida radars because then we only sampled half of Florida. And so that was kind of a bonus to get some information here also about what was happening on the east coast of Florida, which had never been looked at before. I keep pressing the wrong button to advance. Okay, so this is what the data look like in terms of reflectivity, which is a measure of biomass. And we can use information about the way a radar samples the body of birds, which they've tested at the National Weather Center in Oklahoma. So you can use that to say something about the numbers of individuals. It's an estimate, and that's what you see on Birdcast. 3 billion birds are crossing, however, 10 million are crossing Maryland tonight. That's how those estimates are derived. But here you see on the coast of Florida, this is just a really simple image to show what the actual observed data look like. And you can see we do have blockage here. And that's from buildings or mountain terrain or other issues. So it's not full coverage, but this is where the radar would be. And this is approximately 80-kilometer radius. And so you do see patterns right away. You see like this is huge. And is that, I think this is part of a national forest. And then within more urban areas, you see these little clumps of like riverine parks and stuff. And so what we then do is pair these data, which we clump into like a 1 kilometer grid cell, and we pair that data with all of this other geographic and environmental variables that are also sampled at those locations, and use a machine learning model called a boosted regression tree model that accounts for lots of variables, nonlinear relationships and interactions. And we pair all of these data together with the environment, and then we map it out across the landscape between radars. Let's see if I can. And so these are what those maps look like. This was published two years ago. This is the mean spring and the mean autumn distribution of birds around the Gulf of Mexico in stopover habitats. And what you see are the red, orange, and yellow are all high density stopover habitat, but they vary in how consistently they're used. And so low variability. This is high use, low variability. If you were a birder, you could always go to this area in spring and you'd see some really nice fallouts. And the same thing over here in Louisiana. Whereas these yellow areas, so Texas has is pretty busy in spring, but not everywhere is consistent. There are some areas there birds stop occasionally. And so this turns out to be really important for characterizing migration habitats. Is different, and that's different in some ways than breeding, where birds tend to use the same areas over and over. So let's see what else I was going to tell you about this. This bottom map then basically just clips out all of the consistently high use areas between spring and autumn, which may or may not be the most important. Maybe spring's most important on the Gulf of Mexico because it's the habitats where birds are just crossing the Gulf. That's sort of, a harder question, conservation questions. But this is the first glimpse of, hey, what is happening across like the whole Gulf Coast of the US in terms of where birds are stopping and what habitats we might want to be focusing on. So this area, and I don't know if that's like the armpit of Florida, but it turns out to be really, really important. And it is managed. There's a lot of publicly held lands in there, a lot of state and federal forests, but they're not managed for songbird migration. And so this was, Fish and Wildlife Service was interested in this result. And then you also see this swath across the eastern, moving up through the eastern side of Florida. And I think this is that Jacksonville? I'm horrible with Florida. But anyway, this area tends to be also turned out to be really important. And that we thought that was interesting. It might be a mix of birds coming up Florida, as well as some that are coming over from Caribbean and landing there initially. So now I'm going to show you a little video because this is the seasonal means, but we also had bi-weekly information. So every 2 weeks we could make a map like this. And so with that, you get to see the peak. So there's also temporal information. There's also, I got to turn off my phone. My sister's texting me. There's also temporal information about the passage of migration that we can see with these radar. So let me show you that video. Doesn't like the buttons I'm pressing. Okay, so I'll just run this through twice. And the way that I recommend you look at it is first just get a sense of like sort of Gulf wide when peak passage is coming. And so the blue is low, and then I think, oh gosh, I forget the color scheme, like the purple or red is high density. And so you can watch for that peak, and then you can sort of zoom in on like your favorite vacation spot or something and watch the pattern at a more localized area. This is a 1 kilometer grid. So yeah, that's the resolution of the maps. And it goes early to late spring. So that's peak. And that's the mean. I'll show it one more time. So pretty cool. Everybody loves, we all love a good map. I mean, this is really like, is a black box before, and these maps are available. I'll show you part of one from Great Lakes, and the East Coast has one for fall, but not spring. But there's some projects coming out with more like East Coast wide maps. So you're going to see more of this moving forward.
I think David has a question. David, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you. This is really cool. Just trying to make sure I understand. It seems like there's a lot going on in Florida and Texas. Is part of this sort of like, since you focused on that Gulf, Gulf of Mexico area, is it like what parts of Florida should we be specifically looking at? Is that the thing that was sort of hidden before that was most relevant for you, or?
I mean, we had some idea that Texas would be pretty hot in the spring. And we had some idea that in the fall, like that would be shifted east. So you see like a looped kind of pattern of migration, where in the fall there's a bigger concentration here. But looking at the finer scale, I mean, we didn't know what we would find. This was funded by National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And so their interest is really in identifying these hotspot habitats. So, any one of these three maps could be considered a hotspot, depending on what you think is the more important period, spring or fall migration, or both, to focus conservation efforts. I had someone in Texas who was trying to work on getting like their nonprofit to buy a piece of property for a preserve, and sent me a shape file and asked me if I could, make a map of their area to say, so they could use that information to justify it's important for bird migration. I think it worked. So, we were just interested in finding out what's going on, if that answers your question. We didn't know about any of this.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, okay. As a Florida boy, I like to see that you're showing like this is like, it matters for everybody, and like the environment there, right? Like this really has a big impact. So yeah,
that's it. That's a good importance. So coastlines are really important, and coastlines are also where like a huge amount of our land cover change and land cover alteration and development. Everybody wants to live on the coast, and that's also where those habitats are really key for migrants that are going to make the flight across water bodies and then recover from those flights. And not just songbirds, also shorebirds and water birds. And so yeah, coastal areas are really key. And I think the thing that you're saying about Florida is really true for everywhere when you think about migration, which is like migratory animals are connecting all of us. They don't allow us, if we care about preserving animals that are migrating across continents, it's not going to work to only do local work. Like coastlines in Florida might be the thing that saves your Baltimore Oriole in your backyard that comes every year in your big old oak tree. I mean, you need that oak tree too. But yeah, so that is definitely a takeaway message. Which is good, because it's already like 8 o'clock and I'm like honestly barely getting started with my slides. So we'll just see how far we get, right? So yeah, thanks for interrupting and making that comment. That's really helpful. So another thing that we innovated with this project was this thing that we call the stopover to passage ratio. And this in some ways illustrates how hard it is to identify, or to make conservation decisions about stopover habitat. Because the maps that I just showed you they show the relative abundance, like those hot spots during spring, fall, and combined. But that's different, but abundance abundance is not the only measure of importance to migrants. And so what the stopover to passage ratio does is takes the biomass of the numbers of birds in those stopover habitats, and this is the maps I just showed you, and then pairs it with the numbers of birds passing over those areas. So that is the bird cast, which somebody put the link in. That looks at passage through the airspace. And so the stopover to passage ratio is a measure of selection. So use disproportionate to the numbers of birds passing. So where are birds stopping in higher, like where are they selecting habitats, which tells us that those habitats may be particularly important, right? Even outside of just their relative, like there's not just a lot of birds there, it's like birds are picking those areas in particular. So I have a figure of that. This is the spring and fall stopover to passage ratio. And so there's a little bit of number funniness, but it should be, it's a percentage. So it should be 0 to 100, with 100 being like 100% of the birds passing over these areas in spring are stopping. Whereas this is also an important area, but like out here, we saw quite a bit of high density stopover, but it was more inconsistent. And so it's still important, but it's not like that, like in Miami, like all birds coming through Miami in spring practically like fall out, like they need those habitats. And you see something different in fall, like it's shifted west in fall, whereas the densities are shifted east in the fall, but the stopover to passage ratio is shifted west. And so density of use alone is not a comprehensive measure of the conservation value of a stopover site for migratory birds. Oh, and that's what's called the Big Bend. I should have asked the Florida guy who chimed in. This Big Bend area is disproportionately important in the spring. And like I said, I got an email from the Fish and Wildlife Service manager there who was like, this is really helpful, even in just terms of justifying their work or making decisions about what they should be managing for. So this, I won't go into this figure, but it just shows the variability between, so this is the same radar is pretty different between spring and fall. Spring is the open circle and fall is the closed circle. So this is my slide. This is from my PhD advisor. He talked about, he really liked this slide, but it helps to kind of explain why stopover habitat, why density alone isn't the only measure of conservation value for stopover habitat, because birds are really influenced by external forces during migration, unlike when they're in more stationary periods during breeding in winter, where they're returning to those same, even the same nest tree a lot of times. So when a bird is, say, crossing from Belize, crossing the Gulf of Mexico, they're going to encounter really variable wind conditions and weather conditions, and they may adjust their flight altitude accordingly. But it's an energetic cost more than it is. It's more costly to stay on track and potentially not have the energy to do so than it is to go with the wind and preserve your energy and then correct later once you hit land. And so extrinsic factors like weather are really important in determining where along the coastline a bird might stop, east or west. And then once they hit that, once they hit those landscapes, whether or not they stop on the coast or move further inland, this is really nice for riparian habitat here. That might determine how much fat they have from making the trip. So like how much did they burn, which also is related to the conditions they left in Mexico or Belize and is related to the weather they encountered along the way. And so factors more intrinsic to the animal start to become more important as you get to the smaller scales. And so this is comparing two landscapes. And we do know that like factors about the landscape and about the habitat features within the landscape start to become more important after they select where to stop. So birds move around to select certain habitats, and we know that they, we know from radar work that they select areas with higher forest cover within 5 kilometers, for example. So this one, I lost my mouse. This top one's better than the bottom one. And then when you get to this level, it depends on the species. Some species have different dietary needs or preferences. So yeah, it's a hierarchical approach that's a little bit different than breeding and winter. Oh, this is a student study that I threw in here where that gives the example of the first question, where Hannah Klipp was doing her master's with myself and Jeff Bueller at University of Delaware, and she was looking at where birds stop over at these same radars related to the conditions that they encounter over 3 different bodies of water: the Caribbean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Atlantic Ocean, again, during spring. And one of the key things that she found is that spring conditions are usually favorable. So if you go back to like 1904, you know, there's this long debate about whether or not the Gulf of Mexico is a flyway or is a barrier to migration. And so it kind of gets to that idea that it's mostly favorable for migration, except when it isn't. And so one of the things that she found was that birds were falling out on the coast were heavily influenced by what was happening in the Caribbean Sea. And so what that means, or what that implies, is that birds may very well be flying from northern Colombia all the way across the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico to make landfall. And that result has also been supported by from some MODIS tracking work. There's a station down here in Colombia that has been doing a lot of tagging for a while, and they've found birds coming. And the time between when they're detected, it also implies that sometimes there's not only one strategy, right? But that sometimes birds are flying all the way from South America. So yeah, I don't like those maps where they show, like, you know, a little bird on their tiptoes, like at the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula, looking out over the Gulf of Mexico for some straight line distance, because it's an energetic distance that matters, which is tied to weather patterns and wind. It's not a straight line distance that matters. Okay, I don't know. I guess I might get through this next section. I don't know what time I'm supposed to stop talking, but the next part is some of the research that I've been doing on the quality of these habitats where birds are stopping. So how can we learn about, or what do we know about how they're doing in these areas on the ground? And the currency of migration is usually fuel deposition rate. So we look at things like fuel deposition rate at stopovers. There's different measures of health and how long they stay at a stopover. So how many stops and how long do they stay at those stops? This is my field site where I worked. I pre-pandemic, I worked on the Gulf of Mexico for 15 years, my PhD and my postdoc, but now since the pandemic, we're not running those sites anymore. I don't know if we will again, but it's a pretty awesome place to work. This is Clive Runnels' Mad Island Marsh Preserve that the Nature Conservancy owns in the central Texas coast. And this is a little ovenbird with a MODIS tag. Really nice how the light shines on that antenna so you can see it. And we were just starting a study pre-pandemic where we were tracking birds to look at density dependent effects moving north. And so I think I'm gonna close your eyes for a second. Oh, well, I guess I can. So this is some work from the Gulf of Mexico that asked the question of, before I was talking about how birds are arriving to these landscapes on the Gulf of Mexico, but what happens when they land on the ground? How do they make movement, or do they make movement decisions within landscapes to select habitat types? That was the question. And what does that mean as coastal landscapes are changing? Because like I said, these are the areas that are undergoing the most dramatic development. They have the most development pressure. And so this was a study from my PhD where I caught birds at this really long-term spring migration banding station just as they had arrived across the Gulf of Mexico, and put a radio tag on them, move them inland, and release them at these 3 different habitat types in different energetic conditions and throughout the spring, to see how they would move within the landscapes to make habitat decisions. And I measured all sorts of vegetation and food availability and the density of singing birds as competitors and predators and everything, and then built all that information into an individual based model. And so this is taking the information of the behavior on the ground and building it into a predictive model where we can then change the landscape to look at how landscape changes will influence those behaviors. So the initial model was built with birds captured here at Johnson's Bayou and moved and then tracked throughout stopovers inland in Kisatchie National Forest, which is near Fort Polk, which I just read is changing its name as one of the military bases that's changing, getting rid of Confederate names. And then we validated the results. And then we built the individual based model based on the behaviors observed here, and then validated the model behavior by doing subsequent translocation and tracking to the Southern National Forest over in Mississippi. This is all kind of longleaf pine, bottomland hardwood country. So it's pretty similar habitats. And this is what the model looked like. So this is within that Mississippi landscape. This is the place where the bird was released in the middle of pine habitat. And this is a track bird. You can see it moved over into the hardwood pretty quickly, and then it sort of like settled into an area. And then the white tracks are simulated movements using the individual based model within the same landscape, where we use those simple behavioral rules to plunk the land a bird in a video game in a landscape and then have it move according to the rules. And you can see that it worked pretty well. This track moved pretty similarly. They move more linearly initially until they find the hardwood habitat, and then they have more circular, more tortuous behaviors. And so with this information and this model constructed, we're able to ask the question, like, what influences these behaviors and how might changing landscapes influence refueling rate and stopover duration, the currency of migration. And so we took, this was the original landscape and just made it more clumpy. That's what that word means. Just made the habitats into fewer bigger clumps, and then also reduce the overall amount of hardwood, which is the red, which was the highest quality habitat. And what we found was that fuel deposition rates, which just means like how quickly they're putting on fat to continue migration, did better with more forest cover, not shocking. But then also that fuel deposition rates were higher in the more clumped landscape. And so what that meant is they had less searching time, like that initial linear movement. They didn't have to do that. They didn't have to move as far to access that high quality habitat, and they could refuel more quickly. And so the power of this sort of approach is that birds are moving at landscape scale, but it's hard to measure their movements or how they're doing at those same scales. And so having a model like this allows you to say, test what some sort of development, how that might influence the ability of migrants to refuel, or how that might influence the quality of their habitats. Oh, it's got my star. Oh, it got shifted. Anyway, this is supposed to point at this little star. And so that was work that I was doing on the Gulf of Mexico. And more recently, basically since the pandemic, I started my tenure track position. I was at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center for seven or so years. And then 2019, moved up to the Appalachian lab to start a tenure track position. And shortly thereafter, everything shut down, which really changed the trajectory of my research program. But luckily, I got connected with the Powdermill Avian Research Center. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's part of the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. It's their field station, and they have the longest continuously running banding operation in the US anyway. There's a longer one at the Cornish Spit in Russia, but and they have a humongous data set there. And so the research director there is actually doing his PhD in my lab, Luke, in the picture up there. But it is, so this is where I've been doing more of my field-based work, is at Powdermill. And so I'll tell you just a little bit about Luke's project, if it will let me advance. And this is ongoing work. He's just getting started with it, but it's making use of the MODIS wildlife tracking network that Neville mentioned before. And so I don't know if most of you have heard of it yet, but there's all these different towers that are going up all over. This is an older map, so there's a lot more now, and there's even more in Central America. I know Costa Rica has quite a few. But the idea with these is that they're stationary towers. And so if you put these little radio tags, they're called nano tags, on a bird, we're limited by the batteries for tracking songbirds, because that's why you can get these wonderful GPS tracks of ungulates or seabirds that are huge. We can only do 3% of body mass, which means since we've got little 20-gram birds, pretty little. And so this technology works pretty well with that. It does mean that you have no information unless the bird passes through the detection area of one of these towers. This is what they look like here. They're putting up one, these are the Yagi antennas. And so they're pretty cool. Nature centers all over putting them up, because it just like, you can say what birds moved over your nature center. It's like a really great connection with wildlife, having like a live map that you can share with visitors. And so Luke is one of the coordinators of this network of the MODIS, the Northeast MODIS Collaborative. And so his PhD work is making use of these data, putting tags on several different species of specialists and generalists and then testing the idea that they have different migration strategies. So we think of shorebirds as stopping at set locations and then moving, staying a long time in the Delmarva Peninsula, and then moving on to the same place every time and staying for longer periods, whereas little songbirds, like I told you, tend to move around. But that might not be true for like specialist species like a wetland bird, like a Louisiana water thrush. Once they land somewhere and there's good wetland, they might need to stay there for longer. And so that's the idea that he's testing. And he has this whole network of nodes set up across Powder Mill, and that will allow him to triangulate pretty fine scale locations within the habitats. So this is ongoing work. I'm going to skip this one. I guess I'll do like one threats and then we can chat for a little bit, or what time is it?
It's 8:20.
And you finish at 8:30, so should we stop now, or?
You can continue for a little bit longer.
Okay. So what are the threats that birds are encountering in these areas? A lot. Like migrants are really well adapted to this pretty phenomenal behavior, but we're throwing up, artificial lights out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico that are sucking birds into these oil platforms. Wind. Outside cats are just the worst. We don't know much about their impacts during migration. We know that for young birds, they're really quite devastating for birds. That is actually something that one of my PhD students is working on, like the en route, if birds during migration respond appropriately to a house cat. You probably heard about the Twin Towers work with all the sucking, the birds in. Even and with climate change, we have increasing intensity and frequency of hurricanes, for example, during fall migration. So we're throwing up a lot of obstacles for them to overcome. And if we want to identify the important areas for conservation, we also need to take into account if those areas are being managed for biodiversity and what threats there may be to those habitats. So this first one is a paper that I recently published about siting for wind energy. And so this map is just to say wind energy is expanding. We have a lot of it and we need it. And it is, it's only going to grow. That's a good thing. But what we want to do is to just have bird-friendly wind siting. And so we recently used, I'm gonna get my little arrow to come up. We know that billions of birds are migrating through the night across North America, and that wind development can impact wildlife in a number of ways, through direct collisions, through habitat loss, and through altered behavior where they may have to sort of shift the path of migration, or with potential energetic costs. But the good news about that is that it's possible to site in areas to avoid high risk to animals. And it's also possible to temporarily curtail the spinning of the turbines during like the very few nights of peak migration. And so that was the challenge that we addressed with another radar study that was focused around the Gulf of Mexico, the Great Lakes, where there's a lot of wind development, and the Fish and Wildlife Service was really interested in these questions. This is a map of the areas sampled by the Great Lakes coastline radars that we used in the study. And then the green are the current distribution of turbines. And so this is all about onshore I mean, offshore is another question. It's a little harder with the weather radar network because it doesn't reach out all that far. And so these are the sampled areas. This light gray shaded area is the area that we predicted to, in the same way that I showed you for the Gulf of Mexico. And weather radar, like I told you before, for the Gulf of Mexico can record a few different metrics. We talked about the stopover to passage ratio, the selection, and then we also talked about traffic rates, the movement through the airspace overhead, and then stopover density on the ground, like where those high density hotspots. And then we also talked about the stopover phenology, like how it, I'm trying to find my camera, how it peaks, you know, throughout the season. So there is seasonal variability as well. What we were really interested in here was movement through what's called the rotor swept zone. So that's the area that is where if a bird moved through it, they would hit a turbine, they would potentially hit a turbine blade. And so mostly songbirds are overlooked by the wind wildlife, you know, or the wind industry is not something they need to worry about, because a lot of migrants fly really high through the airspace. Now they're up a couple of kilometers above ground level. And so there isn't a lot of current effort to focus on sighting relative to little birds like this. It's more about eagles and things like that are diurnal migrants. And so we wanted to find out what proportion of migration through these Great Lakes coastal radars was through that rotor swept zone. And we found about 30% of migration moved through the rotor swept zone, and about 50% of that movement was near sunrise. I'm going fast now, so I'm not interpreting all these figures now, but too well. But basically, this is just showing the temporal through the night intensity of migration, and you can see how it gets higher through the rotor swept zone earlier in the morning. These are in deciles of the night, which is just like equal intervals because the clock changes throughout the season. So we needed to define it in that way. And there was also variability in movement through that rotor swept zone in the spring and autumn. But this, we were taking bets, like what proportion do we think we'll get, you know, because it's pretty much, songbirds are pretty much dismissed by the wind industry as something they don't need to worry about because they're not having a population level impact. And so this, what we found with this paper is like, that's true, they do fly really high, but here's when they don't fly high, is when they're landing and taking off from stopover habitat. So like I'm over here in the, you are always have to fly through the rotor swept zone if you're landing and taking off at a stopover. And so those are the areas that should be avoided for sighting. And this came out in conservation letters earlier this year. Another really interesting finding that we found, another interesting finding from that study, Fish and Wildlife Service was really interested in setting, like there was a lot of debate in the region, say between the Nature Conservancy, I think it was, or American Bird Conservancy and Fish and Wildlife Service for the guidelines to tell industry how far from the coastline is it okay to build a turbine. And the estimates that they were using, or you know, the guidelines said I think 5 kilometers or 3 kilometers from the coastline, depending on if you were American Bird Conservancy or Fish and Wildlife Service. Hopefully I'm getting that. Hopefully it was American Bird Conservancy. But anyway, what we found, if you actually look at the data, it's 20 kilometers from the coastline where you see this totally clear leveling off. And so 50% of stopover is within 20 kilometers of the coastline. And if you, only 8% was within that initial 5-kilometer distance. So it's not really protecting very much. And if you, using the data, this is a better guideline, 20 kilometers, but all coastlines are not equal. And so it doesn't necessarily make sense to have one set distance from the coastline when Lake Michigan is just really hot. I mean, it's very busy. Whereas if you go over here to Lake Huron, there are a lot of turbines, but they're not within high use areas like these ones are around Lake Michigan. And so the takeaway, the point of this paper was like, we can use these data to make good siting decisions. We don't have to guess. So we'll see what happens with that. And anyway, this is another PhD project. I think I should stop here. This is my student Claire, who finishes in the spring, and she led a lab review paper, and it was talking about how mostly we measure like birds hit at buildings or turbines, or and so direct mortality is what we mostly use to talk about the impacts of anthropogenic threats on birds. But there's a lot of indirect or delayed effects that may be making these anthropogenic threats way more impactful than just counting the number of birds that die below a building. So, and she outlined all the different ways that threats might be interacting with each other to carry over to influence the success of migration in different ways. And that's what these very beautiful but complicated figures are all about. So I'll descend on this one.
Any questions? I know there's a question from Joe about the percentage of birds that get hit through 1R as the, I guess it's probably variable. Is there anything you want to opine on that?
Yeah, we didn't measure that. All we were measuring was the proportion of passage. And so even if they pass through the rotor swept zone, it doesn't mean that they would necessarily hit, it's not a measure of mortality or anything. It's just the measure of exposure. And so the actual impact of wind on nocturnal migrants is probably a lot lower than a lot of other threats, but it's so far been fairly hard to quantify because it's hard to, so Scott Loss, my friend and collaborator, does a lot of work on this, and there isn't a lot of support for a correlation between the predicted, it's really hard to get at this measure of the actual impact, but relative to other threats, wind's pretty low. Like light is what matters. That light sucks birds in, and then they spin around and hit windows and get eaten by things. So it really is an interaction that matters.
Gotcha.
Yes, somebody has a question.
Yeah, Joe, do you have a follow-up question? You're on mute. We can't hear you, Joe.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah. So as far as birds going through a wind turbine, I mean, the actual blade surface area is like 1% of the total surface area of the zone. And then a bird flying through that, so it's pretty, pretty likely that it won't get hit going through a turbine zone.
I don't know if that's true, that it's likely that it won't get hit. They also get sucked in by the spinning of the blade, I think, but it's definitely not.
Yeah, but there's some, I've done some study, I've worked on, but the sucking in pushes it past the blade. doesn't necessarily suck it into the blade.
Mhm.
Blade tips travel almost near the speed of sound. They're pretty fast at the end.
They travel about 60 miles an hour. It's not the speed of sound. It depends. I don't know of any that travel the speed of
That's
sound.
not what I read.
Yeah,
Well, I don't think that little birds, for example, this isn't anything they're adapted to deal with, right? So like we already know from other studies that like their birds are not very good at crossing at like estimating like we will, oh, I can jaywalk here because that car's not going very fast. And I can make it across the road. This is not a thing that birds are good at doing. And I think it would be similar for a wind turbine in that like I don't know that they're going to be like, there wouldn't be any reason to expect that they would have adapted the ability to like circle around and avoid.
no, they
Um,
wouldn't circle around it, but it's it's very unlikely that a single bird is going to get hit because of the amount of area that it has to go.
Yeah,
and
I
the
think
speed of
that
the
it
bird
is
and the
a,
speed of the turbine.
but also it depends on if there's lights on the turbine as well, like.
Oh,
it
yeah,
should be
right.
Bird-friendly lighting would make a big difference, but I agree with you. I don't think that it is anywhere near like the top of the list for threats to
not.
birds.
It's not,
But
yeah.
there's no reason to ignore the science that says these are really high use areas with high exposure that would have much higher impacts than other areas.
Yes.
And
That's what I'm not so sure of. I'm not seeing any good studies of that. How many birds are actually getting hit compared to how many are going through? I don't think we know really right now. And I think
we don't know. We don't know. All we know is like relative exposure. And so that's certainly important, is the relative exposure. We do know from like where I am up in Appalachia, like these surveys of like recently installed, it's been a while, but I was reading all these reports for a proposal a while ago. I mean, they collect a lot of migrants, especially up on the ridge lines that have been hit by turbines, including things like cerulean warblers and golden wing warblers that are declining. And so the thing that I think is in question is whether or not, like, they're probably not at the level where they're having population level impacts right now. Like I wouldn't think so. And that's why they're pretty much wind ignores songbirds at this point. But if we develop a lot of wind along coastlines where birds are, that's what matters to them, coastlines, and along ridge lines during migration, I don't see a reason to
oh no, we got to check it out. I'm not saying don't check it out.
ignore the data showing that one area would be way less impactful than another area, even if the impact is much less overall than buildings. Like,
but,
I mean,
if we have a chance to look at buildings, for instance, or cats versus turbines, we'd be better off looking at buildings or cats because there's so many more birds die there.
True, but that's not really how conservation works.
Yeah.
I mean, like the cat people aren't hanging out talking to the wind people. Like, we have to work on everything.
Yeah, well, one of my biggest concerns is that a lot of focus against the wind industry is being generated by the oil industry and the power industry because of the competition. And, you know, and
yeah, so I know that happened with the icebreaker project. Yeah.
Oh, and by the way,
so nothing in our study was anti-wind in any way. It's all about right sighting and bird-friendly sighting.
Right.
And I think that's a no-brainer. And I think it is like, I guess if turning it around to talk about how the impacts are low immediately, like sort of takes away from the importance of using, makes it so the data is less likely to be used in a way that it could very easily be used effectively to minimize the impacts that do exist.
Oh, and then the tip speed is 100 miles an hour for most of the turbines. So I'm not sure where someone got the speed of sound, but I think we might want to check that.
I am seeing one that says 180 miles per hour, so I apologize about the incorrect number. 100 is pretty fast.
Yeah, it's pretty fast, but it's not anywhere near the speed of sound, which is like 1,000.
All right, I'm going to ask David, who's patiently waiting to ask his question, to go ahead and ask a question.
Thanks. And no, I mean, I think it's important to talk about all this stuff.
Absolutely.
But thanks, Neville. Yeah, I just wanted to, and I know we're over time already. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more, Dr. Cohen, about what are some ways to find out, should we be doing more community science? Is it that labs need to set up some like big team science approaches to get a better feel for these stopover areas that we don't know about? Do we need like multiple labs working together? What is the way to make progress in that area?
Well, like any scientist, I'll say funding. I mean, we need more focus on stopover, and so I don't think there's I mean, there's more that could be done if we could get funding to do more of these radar studies, for example, and pair those with the eBird maps, and yeah.
Maybe wind can fund some studies to show how they're doing a much better job than oil.
Yeah,
That's a good idea.
I like it.
There's two messages, one from Valerie, very interesting, and thank you for sharing this. Good luck to you and your team. And a message from Michelle, thank you, very interesting talk. Anybody else have any other questions?
Thanks, Neville. Good job.
Well,
all right, thanks,
All right.
everybody.
well, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Emily. This is great. I wish we had some more time to look at the last point, maybe another time.
I knew I would have too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But keep in touch, and we would love to know more about how this science is progressing and what we find out more about this topic. So who knows, maybe we'll do a recap in 3 years, 2 years. I don't know. You tell me how fast this research moves. But yeah, this is a very interesting topic. I think a lot of our members are definitely, I think everybody's excited about migration and seeing birds that we don't always see. And it's always nice to know what they're going through as they get to us so that we can see them. So thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate you discussing this topic with us. This is actually the last of our fall lecture season. Our next event is going to be the covered dish dinner in January. As we get closer, we will let everybody know more about that event. And I hope to see you between then and now. I hope to see everybody on the trail looking at birds. Thank you very much, and good night, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for the questions.
Thank you. Great talk.